Good day, boxing fans. These past 2 weeks, we saw two absolutely scintillating performances by two of the sport's elite operators. First up, it was Naoya Inoue who conquered a fourth weight class when he destroyed unified WBO and WBC junior featherweight champion Stephen Fulton in 8 rounds. And then a week later, it was the turn of Terence Crawford when he took 1 round more to stop Errol Spence Jr. to become the undisputed welterweight champion of the world. I think it's fairly safe to say that the top spot in the mythical pound-for-pound rankings is reserved for either one of these two. Who do you think is the best pound-for-pound fighter in the world right now? Is it the monster, Naoya Inoue, or is it Bud, Terence Crawford, the undisputed welterweight champion? I'm going to share my thoughts here, and I hope you guys will also weigh in the comment section. If it interests you, then stick around. Okay guys, when we talk about this pound for pound list, this mythical list about how the best boxers in the world stack up against each other if we measure them against their accomplishments, it's important that we understand what we are really talking about. We're not talking about a mythical or a theoretical matchup here where, for instance, if we could enlarge Inoue to be a welterweight and him and Bud fought each other, who will win? It's not that kind of argument. When we think about who is pound for pound the best fighter in the world, we compare our elite operators across the weight divisions, then we have to take into account not only their last effort, their last performance, but their entire body of work throughout their career. And that doesn't always only go with titles won, but to me, at least the way I work it out, is always the most important, is the quality of opposition. Who did they fight? What was the record of those opponents? Did they hold any titles? Although titles are a bit secondary to me. When did that fighter fight those opponents? That's also important. Did that big name on their record, they both have many big names, but did that opponent that they beat, what did that opponent do after they've beaten them? Did that opponent still go on and do something, or did they catch them at the tail end of their careers? That's also a consideration. So looking at all these factors, I went and I did a little bit of my own research just to freshen up, because we know them by heart by now, but sometimes you need to look a little bit closer when you look at the numbers. Now let's start with a monster, Naoya Inoue there in Japan. He's got a record of 25 wins, 0 losses, 22 knockouts, just like Bud, very high knockout ratio. Now let's look at the world champions he has beaten, and this is quite impressive. In only his 4th professional bout, he beat Ryoichi Taguchi, and after he beat Taguchi later went on to become a unified world junior flyweight champion. He held both the WBA and IBF titles, and he became the ring champion as well. He made 7 defenses of that WBA title of his, adding the IBF and ring belts, and eventually lost it in a close decision to our own Hecky Butler. But beating a guy like that in your 4th professional fight takes some doing, and in only his 6th pro bout, he became a world champion for the first time, Inoue, when he beat Adrian Hernandez for the WBC Junior Flyweight Championship. Who was Adrian Hernandez? Now, Adrian Hernandez was a world champion with 7 successful world title defenses. So it was not a guy who was just there and just got the belt and something like that. He beat a pretty solid world champion. And then he didn't stay long in that weight division. He made 1 world title defense, and then he skipped over the flyweights and he jumped up to junior flyweight, and he won the WBO title against Omar Narvaez. Now, if we look at Narvaez held the WBO flyweight title before he had the junior bantamweight or super flyweight title. He made 16 successful title defenses of his WBO flyweight belt, and then he moved up to junior bantamweight. And from that WBO belt, before he lost it to Inoue, he made 11 successful title defenses. That's 27 successful title defenses over 2 reigns combined. So Narvaez is not an exciting fighter, but he knows how to survive and he knows how to eke it out. That's impressive stats. And he also challenged unsuccessfully for the bantamweight title twice, losing to Nonito Donaire, whom we all know is a future Hall of Famer. And then after losing to Inoue, he could still resurrect his career to challenge Zolani Tete for the WBO title, and he went the distance with both those operators, but Inoue destroyed him in a couple of rounds. So that's very impressive victory to me by Naoya Inoue. And then he proceeded to make 7 successful defenses of his WBO junior bantamweight title, and he also beat another world champion during those reign, and that's his Japanese countryman Kohei Kono, who was at one stage a WBA world champion, and then he moved up to bantamweight. So I'm going to count his bantamweight title defenses. When I talk about world titles, I mean the top tier belt in the big 4 organizations, the WBA, WBC, IBF and WBO. So I try to weed out all regular and interim titles and all of that. It gets quite difficult, especially with WBA. But I'm not going to count Jamie McDonnell as a world champion because he had the regular belt that Inoue took for him, but he destroyed him. Juan Carlos Payano was a world champion before he fought Inoue. He was the WBA super champion, I think, at some stage. So that was another world champion that Inoue absolutely destroyed in one round, and that was Juan Carlos Payano. And I started his bantamweight reign when he won the IBF world title and the ring belt from Emmanuel Rodriguez in his sole appearance in the UK. Destroyed Rodriguez. If you look at Rodriguez, he still competed successfully after that. You know, won a few, lost a few, didn't win a world title again. But a guy who's not a great world champion, but no slouch. And he added the WBA belt against Nonito Donaire. Now, there was a fight where Inoue looked the most vulnerable, because he had to walk through fire to eventually beat Donaire on points. And at one point, Donaire had him hurt, and he had him wobbling, and it didn't look good for Inoue, but he showed the heart of a champion, and he pulled through. So then we also beat Jason Maloney in his bantamweight reign, who is the current WBO bantamweight champion. And he also unified the entire bantamweight division against Paul Butler, who was of course a former IBF bantamweight champion as well, and he held the WBO title there sort of by default. And then he moved up and he beat Stephen Fulton, who was a unified champion. He unified the WBO and WBC belts. So if we look at Inoue, we look at his title fights. You know, he's a WBC champion, a junior flyweight, a WBO champion, a junior bantamweight, undisputed bantamweight champion, unified all the belts. He's now a unified junior featherweight champion, and he's going to try and unify all of those belts as well. But all in all, he's had 18 world title fights in total. All the title fight defenses and the fights where he won the world titles combined. So he has got 18 world title fights in his only 25 pro bouts. He's obviously won all of them, and in doing so, he's defeated 10 world champions. Now, if we go to Terence Crawford, let's see how Bud stacks up. Now, he's had a much longer career. Terence Crawford is 40-0 with 31 knockouts, and he's been at the elite level for a long time. So these knockout ratios of these two fighters are very impressive, because as we all see it, the guys knock everybody out, and as the competition gets better, once they're on a world title level, the knockouts just drops away usually. But he won his first world title that he took a lot longer than Inoue did in his 23rd bout. Sorry for that interruption. This is a working house. My dog went off there. But back to Terence Crawford. That first world title win of him in his 21st fight in Scotland happened against Ricky Burns. He went into the Lions Den and he won a wide-ish decision there. Now, he didn't stay that long at lightweight. He made 2 title defenses, but he beat former unified featherweight champion and Yuriorkis Gamboa. Gamboa gave him a good fight. He nailed Crawford a couple of times. He buzzed him slightly, but it wasn't like Inoue against Donaire. He didn't have to dig quite that deep. And he stopped Gamboa. And then he also beat Ray Beltran, who was supposed to be sort of an uncrowned champion because he was on the wrong end of a controversial decision against Burns in Scotland. But he beat Ray Beltran as well. And that bout was also for the ring belt at lightweight. And then he went up to junior welterweight. Now, at junior welterweight, he picked up a vacant WBO title against Thomas Dulorme. But he eventually unified that WBO belt with a WBC champion, Victor Postel. Now, we know Victor Postel, he of course gave Josh Taylor as well as Jose Ramirez absolute hell on subsequent title shots after he lost to Lucas Matissa. So he was a very solid champion. Even Ray Beltran was WBO lightweight champion at some stage as well. So there's another 2 world champions. So when he went on and unified all the belts at junior welterweight, and he had the ring belt as well by that stage, by knocking out Julius Indongo. Now, Indongo had a spectacular fall in his career after he lost for the first time against Terence Crawford, but he was undefeated and he did win the IBF and WBA belts on the road in Russia and in Scotland by beating Edward Trojanowski and Ricky Burns as well. And when Crawford jumped up to welterweight, he beat Jeff Horn, beat him comprehensively, and of course he made 7 title defenses of that welterweight belt before unifying everything against Errol Spence Jr. So in that process, he also beat Amir Khan. We know Amir Khan was a unified junior welterweight champion. He beat Cal Brook, the former IBF champion. You can sort of make the argument that Khan and Brook were on the downsides of a career. But he also beat Sean Porter, who was a former IBF as well as WBC champion. And he became the only man to stop Sean Porter. And then, of course, he gave his performance the other night against Errol Spence Jr. So if we look at this resume, then we have Crawford making 2 title defenses at lightweight, unifying the junior welterweight division. From that initial WBO belt, he made 6 defenses in the process and 7 defenses again as a welterweight. So once again, this is an interesting thing. It comes down to 18 world title fights. The same number of world title fights that Naoya Inoue had, so did Terence Crawford. And he of course won them all. And if we look at the number of world champions that Terence Crawford fought, we also arrive at the same figure, 10 world champions. So both Inoue and Terence Crawford are winners in 18 world title fights, and they've beaten 10 world champions in their career. Now, if we look at Inoue, Nonito Donaire is definitely a future Hall of Famer. And if we look at Terence Crawford, I would say Errol Spence he's also did enough to just get in the Hall of Fame. So the quality of opposition is very much the same thing. So the body of work, the accomplishments is sort of similar to me. Yes, Inoue is a 4-weight world champion and Terence Crawford is a 3-weight world champion. But remember, the gaps between the weights are smaller there in the lighter division. So it's much of a muchness to me. The quality of opposition, the number of good fighters fought is very much the same. There's not too much to choose between the two when you really break it down. So then we have to go back to their last performance. Who had the best performance in their last fight? Crawford against Spence Jr. or Inoue against Stephen Fulton? I think the performance of both guys is sort of on the same level. It was a clinical taking apart of an opponent. Now, if we break those victories down further, who beat the better opponent? Inoue or Crawford? Now, Crawford beat Errol Spence Jr., who was a 3-belt champion, and he's had some very solid elite level wins under his belt against guys like Porter. There was Mikey Garcia and there was Danny Garcia, both the Garcias, and Jordanis Ugas. So Spence Jr. compared to Stephen Fulton, I think Crawford had the better opponent in front of him. Now, Spence Jr. is definitely a top pound for pounder. He was in everybody's top 5 pound for pound, whereas Stephen Fulton wasn't. So on their last performance, even though the quality was the same, I would say Terence Crawford fought the better guy in Errol Spence Jr. as compared to Stephen Fulton. So then, if we look at it like that, then we got to say that Terence Crawford maybe just pips Inoue for the number 1 spot. Because the other contenders are people like Alexander Usyk, and Usyk has lost a lot of momentum now, a bit of inactivity in a Tyson Fury fight not happening. So it's between these two. But let me flip the script around now. You know, I was thinking like that, and I think, okay, Terence Crawford for the number 1 spot. But then we can also look at it from a different angle. Crawford accomplished all of this, same number of world title fights, same number of world champions. Crawford accomplished all of this in 40 fights, whereas Inoue did it all just in 25 fights. So if you look at it from that angle, Inoue has about the same accomplishments as Crawford in terms of world champions fought, world title fights won. Then he's got the same numbers, 18 world title fights, 10 world champions, and he did it in 25 fights as compared to Crawford, who took 40 fights to do it. So there you have it again. Then the argument also becomes difficult. Now they both have one, I think, surefire Hall of Famer. You can reason that Omar Narvaez, with all those world title defenses that he did make, might be Hall of Fame worthy, but his losses against Inoue, Tete, and of course Nonito Donaire hurts him. And I wonder, we battled to get Vianney Bungu into the Hall of Fame. I don't think Omar Narvaez is going to make it, but he may well. You never know with these things. So it's a very much of a muchness. So we've got, if we rank on their last performances, then it's Terence Crawford. If you look at their whole body of work through their entire careers, it's very, very even. It's hard to separate these two. If you look at the form book, then again, if we look at Terence Crawford, he's never really looked like losing to me. Yes, Crawford does give away early rounds, but you never get the impression that the opponent is actually going to win. It's the way Crawford fights. He hangs back and then he comes on later. Then, of course, if you look at Inoue in that fight against Nonito Donaire, at the middle of that fight, when Donaire was coming on, it sort of looked like Inoue was going to fall apart. So if you look at it from that angle again, I think Inoue has come closer in his career to losing and that's only in that one fight than Terence Crawford has. So then again, then the pendulum swings a little back to Terence Crawford. So I really cannot make up my mind. I was swinging this way between Terence Crawford and Naoya Inoue. I haven't looked at how the ring has reshuffled their pound-for-pound ratings, and I haven't looked at how the Transnational Boxing Rankings Board, that's another independent ranking system that I respect very much, has reshuffled their pound-for-pound places. I would guess, if I have to guess now, I'm doing this before checking out who their pound-for-pound number one is. I would guess that Terence Crawford might just pip Naoya Inoue because there's always a bit of an American bias. You see that in the Hall of Fame. It's just the way it is. And I, because I'm South African, I know what the foreign fighters that are not from America or not even from the UK, those are the big boxing hotspots that they have to go through to go and get a world title. So one side of me sort of feels maybe has a little bias towards Naoya Inoue because he's from Japan, because he's from a small country going up against these guys. If we look at both of them, Inoue has fought in the States, Inoue has fought in the UK. Crawford really, like most American fighters, he doesn't travel, but he did go to Glasgow and beat Ricky Burns. So once again, where we have it, also a little bit even maybe a slight edge to Inoue. So to make up one's mind here is just very, very, very difficult. So I'm going to go and I'm going to say that I'm going to keep. I want to keep Naoya Inoue on the top spot because he's done all of this in only 25 fights. But then Crawford beat a really elite level opponent. So if I go this way, I go that way. If you got Crawford number one, if you got Inoue number one, I think they both should be between 1 and 2. Those are the two top guys in world boxing right now. And, one day I lean this way, one day I lean that way. But I've got to stick my neck out at some point, don't I? You don't want to listen to me go on forever. So I'm going to give it to Terence Crawford simply because of a caliber opponent he beat in Bud. Although it's an amazing accomplishment what Inoue did in 25 fights. And I'm going to give it to Crawford simply because I haven't really looked at one of his fights and thought he might get beaten today. And I had that once with Inoue and Donaire in the first fight. So because of that, I'm just going to pip Crawford there. But I think if Inoue goes now and he suddenly unifies all the belts and unify all the junior featherweight belts, he might surpass Crawford again. And if Crawford maybe beats Jaron Ennis convincingly, I think that's a big challenge for Terence Crawford. That's a fight I want to see. Then maybe Crawford is going to stay at number 1. Or if Crawford move up and beats Jamel Charlo, I think Charlo has got other things going with Canelo Alvarez maybe, but it can interchange. If one guy sneezes or has a cold, the other guy is going to leapfrog him. So that's what I think. I'm going to put Terence Crawford just with the slimmest of margins, for the reasons I've mentioned, above Naoya Inoue. But tomorrow when I wake up, I might feel different. But you guys in the comment section, please tell me, what do you think? Who should be pound for pound number 1 in the world, Terence Crawford or Naoya Inoue? And most importantly, tell me why you think so. Because I went here and I did the research it as best I could. Tell me, why do you have either as pound for pound number 1, or if you have somebody else as pound for pound number 1, please tell us again. And I would be interested in that opinion as well. So that's it. That's a pound for pound list. It gets the casual boxing fans and a lot of fans really hot under the collar. But strangely enough, the editor of Ring, Doug Fisher, tweeted the other day, and I answered him. He says, when you with hardcore boxing people in the industry, like for example fighters, managers, trainers, when you're sitting there before and after the tournaments at the weigh-ins having a chat, how much of your conversation is about pound for pound lists? And hardly ever. And he was right. If I'm sitting here in South Africa and I'm talking to trainers and boxers and whatever, we very seldom talk about pound for pound. We talk more about fights and who's the best in the weight division maybe. So that's an interesting point too, because actually this pound for pound is an academic exercise, and it's a way, something that us boxing fans like, and it's become a sort of a prestige attached to it, and it is always an interesting debate. So that's how I feel about this, Terence Crawford and Naoya Inoue. So guys, if you watched this far, please punch that thumbs up, give the channel a like, and please consider hitting the subscribe. I would greatly appreciate that. And until we see each other again, remember to keep those hands up.